30 myths await you. 30 times you'll experience that unique thrill, a mix of astonishment, slight embarrassment, and exhilaration. Astonishment at how far removed the truth was. Embarrassment for having believed for so long. Exhilaration at discovering that the reality is far more fascinating. If you are prepared to uncover the truths behind the myths that have persisted for centuries, show your support for this series with a like and share in the comments which revelation shocked you the most. This will inspire us to delve into new archives. And so, the first door is open. Step inside. Myth number 1. The naked genius in the bath, or how beautiful legends are born. Visualize this scene. It's before you in all its vivid and irrefutable glory. Syracuse, around 212 BC. An elderly man with a disheveled gray beard immerses himself in a full bathtub. Water splashes over the sides. Suddenly, illumination. He leaps up, wet, naked, filled with the ecstasy of discovery, and rushes through the streets, shouting one word to the entire city. "Eureka! I found it!" Neighbors recoil in shock, children laugh, and the great Archimedes remains oblivious to everything. He has grasped one of the fundamental laws of physics. This image is firmly entrenched in humanity's cultural memory. It is reproduced in textbooks, featured in documentaries, and recounted in physics classes worldwide. Archimedes in the bath represents the quintessence of genius, the idea of sudden inspiration, and serves as a symbol of science. For centuries, this tale has been cited as evidence that great discoveries do not arise in the quiet of a laboratory, but instead during moments of serendipity. Yet here's a question that nearly no one asks. Who, in fact, witnessed this? The story of Archimedes, the bathtub, and the cry of Eureka originates from a single source, the treatise by the Roman architect Vitruvius, written around 200 years after Archimedes' death. 2 centuries of oral transmission, retellings, and inevitable embellishments and simplifications. Vitruvius himself was neither a mathematician nor a scientist. He recounted this story in passing, within a treatise on architecture, to illustrate a problem that supposedly had been posed to Archimedes by King Hiero II, to determine whether a jeweler had mixed silver into a gold crown. The task, it should be noted, was entirely real and quite challenging. The crown weighed exactly as it should, yet the king harbored doubts. And this is where the most intriguing revelation begins. The law of Archimedes, as described by Vitruvius, through the displacement of water, actually does not work for solving the crown's dilemma, mathematically, at all. Consider this. The difference in volume between a pure gold crown and one mixed with silver, while maintaining the same weight, would be negligibly small. We're talking about fractions of a cubic centimeter. The measuring devices of antiquity lacked the necessary precision to detect such a difference in the volume of displaced water. This is not conjecture. It's a fundamental calculation that modern physicists conducted in an attempt to replicate the experiment. The method does not work. At least, not in the rudimentary form of a bathtub overflowing with water. How did Archimedes truly solve the problem? There are several theories among researchers, and one of the most compelling belongs to Galileo, who in 1586 wrote a brief treatise titled La Bilancetta, the Little Balance. In this work, Galileo proposed that Archimedes employed hydrostatic scales, weighing an object first in air and then in water to ascertain its specific weight. This method is significantly more precise and aligns much better with the level of mathematical rigor characteristic of Archimedes' works. Another delicate point is that Archimedes himself never mentions a bath or the cry of Eureka. His own writings that have survived to this day, on floating bodies, on the measurement of a circle, the method, are composed in a dry, rigorous mathematical language. Archimedes appears to have been a person obsessed with proofs and the rigor of reasoning. The very idea that he would dash into the street naked, leaving his thoughts unfinished, contradicts everything we know about his character and working method. So why then has this story endured, flourished, and become canonical? Because it addresses a deep human need. We enjoy the notion that genius is a flash, a lightning strike, a moment. We are less comfortable with the idea that genius involves years of grueling labor, mountains of written papyrus, and hundreds of discarded hypotheses. The tale of the bath is beautiful and democratic. It suggests that a discovery could happen for you, at home, in your bathtub. The narrative of years of systematic work is far less inspiring. The word eureka, however, could very well have belonged to Archimedes, just not necessarily shouted while naked in the street. Moreover, eureka is the first-person singular perfect form of the Greek verb euryskine, which means to find. This is a perfectly ordinary Greek word that anyone could have uttered upon making a discovery. Finding keys, finding a solution to a problem, finding a lost child. The real Archimedes is a far more majestic and intriguing figure than a cheerful old man in a bathtub. He was an individual who single-handedly developed methods of integral calculus 18 centuries before Newton and Leibniz, armed only with a reed pen and papyrus. He was an engineer whose machines, catapults, cranes, and possibly a system of mirrors for igniting ships, kept Roman legions in fear during nearly 3 years of the siege of Syracuse. He was a mathematician who calculated the number pi with remarkable precision using the method of inscribed and circumscribed polygons, maintaining that accuracy unchallenged for centuries. In 212 BC, when a Roman soldier ultimately killed him, defying a direct order from Marcellus to bring the scholar back alive, Archimedes was reportedly engrossed in geometric drawings on the sand. "Do not disturb my circles," are said to be his last words, according to various sources. This story is also likely apocryphal, but it conveys the man's character far more accurately than the bath and street cries do. Archimedes deserves to be remembered for who he truly was, not a fortunate individual who happened to have leaves fall into his bath, but rather one of the greatest intellects to ever inhabit the earth, who worked methodically, rigorously, and tirelessly. It's just this narrative is less marketable. As we bid farewell to the image of the wet genius running through the streets, we are greeted by the next myth, about individuals commonly perceived as filthy and ignorant. The myth of the Middle Ages, born not from the ignorance of those it describes, but from the arrogance of those who fabricated it. Myth number 2, the dirty Middle Ages, or how the Enlightenment slandered the past. In contemporary language, the term medieval has become synonymous with backwardness, savagery, and filth. Expressions like medieval methods, medieval thinking, and medieval unsanitary conditions are used to describe something absolutely unacceptable in the 21st century. At the core of this terminology lies a specific image: dark streets of European cities, littered with waste, filthy, unwashed people in rags who genuinely believed that bathing was a sin, as exposing one's naked body invited the devil, and water washed away the sacred chrism of baptism. Where did this image originate? From the writings of Renaissance figures, and particularly those of the Enlightenment, individuals who fashioned their identity in opposition to the Dark Ages, they found it advantageous to portray the preceding era as a pit of ignorance from which they rescued humanity. They executed this with great relish and literary flair. The result was so compelling that it persists in the collective consciousness to this day. The problem is simple. It's false. Let's start with something basic, the sources. If we examine medieval medical treatises, of which a vast number have survived, we'll find regular prescriptions for bathing. The famous Canon of Medicine by Avicenna, written in the 11th century and serving as the primary medical textbook in European universities until the 17th century, elaborates on personal hygiene rules, how often one should bathe, what the water temperature should be, and how bathing affects health. Medieval monastic rules, the Rule of St. Benedict and its numerous derivatives, contain specific directives regarding hand washing before meals and frequent bathing. Medieval cities had public baths, not meager puddles, actual baths equipped with hot water, scrapers, and staff. In 13th century Paris, documents from that era indicate there were over 26 public baths. In London, establishments known as stews provided hot baths. In many German cities, baths operated several times a week, and visiting them was a regular part of urban life, much like going to a cafe today. Of course, wealthy individuals had baths in their homes. Detailed descriptions of bathing procedures in castles have survived, even specifying the additives to the water: rose water, aromatic herbs, flower petals. Expensive bath oils were a commodity and are mentioned in inventories of affluent households. Body rubbing gloves, a medieval equivalent of sponges, were sold in marketplaces. Now, let's discuss theology. Was there a belief in the Middle Ages that bathing was a sin? Yes, some theologians expressed caution regarding luxurious baths. However, their concerns were far removed from hygiene. Baths served as places of social mingling where men and women sometimes found themselves dangerously close to one another, where prostitution thrived, and where individuals relaxed and entertained themselves. The Church's criticism of baths was more about debauchery than cleanliness. Church fathers who advocated for asceticism sometimes overtly abstained from bathing as a form of bodily pleasure. Yet this behavior represented an ascetic practice of a minority rather than a societal norm. What then caused the significant decline in hygiene during certain periods? Not theology, but epidemics. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, wiping out a third of the continent's population, contemporary physicians became concerned that the open pores of the skin after a hot bath made individuals vulnerable to miasmas, toxic vapors that were then believed to be the cause of illness. Though this theory was flawed, it was rooted in medical rather than religious reasoning. Following these epidemics, the frequency of bathing did indeed decrease, and this decline persisted from the 14th to the 17th century. This era became the source of later descriptions of the unwashed Europe. However, this does not represent the entire medieval era, but rather a specific historical period driven by particular fears. There's another aspect that entirely dismantles the caricature of medieval hygiene. Washing practices during this time were quite advanced. Clothes were washed, bleached, and aired out. Underclothes, shirts, and petticoats were laundered regularly due to their contact with the body. Body odor was socially unacceptable in medieval society, just as it is today. There are documented accounts indicating that insufficient cleanliness led to public disapproval. So, where does the persistent odor of this myth originate? In part, from the confusion between poverty and filth. Poor individuals throughout history have tended to be less hygienic than the wealthy, not due to beliefs, but due to a lack of resources. A peasant living in a single room with livestock was indeed not a model of hygiene, but neither was an urban poor person in the slums of 19th century London or 20th century New York. This is not a medieval specificity, but rather a feature of poverty. Moreover, there is a literary aspect at play. Lives of ascetic saints who deliberately renounced comfort were perceived by later readers as descriptions of a norm. Saint Simeon the Stylite went years without washing. This is a portrayal of virtue, not a standard practice. The real medieval period was more complex, contradictory, and cleaner than its reputation suggests. This revelation is important not because we need to rehabilitate the past, but because it serves as a reminder that every era tends to depict the previous one as dark in order to shine more brightly itself. This is not a historical methodology. This is propaganda. By the way, the next myth also concerns reputation, not of an era, but of a war. It discusses how convenient explanations for defeats rewrite history to favor those who are uncomfortable with the truth. Myth number 3, betrayed soldiers or who really lost Vietnam. There are narratives that a nation tells itself to cope with defeat, not because they are truthful, but because they are psychologically necessary. The version of the war that was betrayed by those at home is one such narrative, and it is proven to be so resilient that it still resonates from pulpits, in films, and in political speeches. The image is simple and alluring. The American soldier is brave, professional, and undefeated on the battlefield. The Viet Cong suffer casualties at a rate of 10 to 1 or even higher. But back home, in university lecture halls and on television screens, the anti-war movement undermines morale, journalists deliver demoralizing reports, and politicians, pressured by the crowd, cut funding and force the army to abandon the mission midway. Soldiers, who have not lost a single battle, lost the war due to betrayal at home. This concept is known as the stab in the back, analogous to the German legend of Dolchstoßlegende following the First World War. And it is just as historically unfounded. Let's examine the facts, not the images, but the numbers and documents. American forces did indeed win the majority of tactical encounters. This is true. However, the military strategy of North Vietnam did not initially aim for victory in tactical confrontations. It aimed for victory over time. General Vo Nguyen Giap and his strategists understood that they could not destroy the American army in open combat. They set themselves a different goal: to inflict sufficient casualties so that American society would grow weary of the war and demand its end. This is not a secret. It is a documented strategy that Giap articulated publicly. In other words, the anti-war movement was not the cause of American defeat, but rather a target of enemy strategy. This fundamentally alters the assessment of the situation. American society functioned exactly as anticipated in Hanoi, not because it was weak or traitorous, but because democracies respond to human losses, while the communist government of North Vietnam could ignore its own personnel costs at a price unattainable for a democratic state. Now let's discuss the military failures that are conveniently obscured in the betrayal at home narrative. The strategy of body count, measuring success by the number of enemy killed, created monstrous incentives for falsifying reports. Unit commanders felt pressured to exaggerate enemy casualties for their careers. Reports were sent up the chain of command, where they were further embellished, and the Pentagon received a picture of a victorious war that bore no resemblance to reality. This issue has been extensively documented, including internal investigations by the U.S. Army. The pacification program, an attempt to exert control over the rural population of South Vietnam, failed not due to protests in Berkeley, but due to fundamental misunderstandings of the nature of warfare. American strategists brought with them models from World War II and Korea, conflicts between states with clear front lines, and encountered a completely different situation where the front was everywhere and nowhere, and the enemy was indistinguishable from the civilian. The New Year Offensive of 1968, Tet, was a turning point not because the American army was decisively defeated. Militarily, the Viet Cong offensive was repelled with heavy losses for the attackers. However, it shattered the primary narrative that the Johnson administration sold to Americans, that the war was coming to a victorious conclusion, that the light at the end of the tunnel could be seen. If the adversary could simultaneously attack over 100 populated areas throughout South Vietnam, it meant that the narrative was a falsehood. And the American people recognized this, not because journalists had betrayed them, but because the facts became undeniable. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973, which the Nixon administration presented as an honorable peace, were, in essence, a capitulation with a delay. The terms agreed upon by the United States were categorically unacceptable in 1969, but quite acceptable in 1973. North Vietnamese troops remained in the south of the country. This was not a victory. It was a managed withdrawal. The anti-war movement undoubtedly influenced policy. However, it was a symptom, not a cause. The real issue was that the war was indeed going poorly, and American families receiving death notices had the right to know. The legend of betrayal from within is convenient because it deflects responsibility from military and political leadership, placing it on those who were merely reacting to the loss of their children. It is a morally inverted narrative, and this is precisely why it is so appealing to decision-makers. Nevertheless, myths about the right cause emerged long before Vietnam. The next myth, concerning the most celebrated of military campaigns in Christianity, will reveal how a noble legend obscures a much more prosaic reality. Myth number 4. God wills it, or what really drives the Crusaders? Deus vult. God wills it. This cry resonated throughout the crowd in Claremont in November of 1995, when Pope Urban II delivered a speech that changed history. Thousands of people, according to chroniclers, immediately began sewing red crosses onto their shoulders, symbols of pilgrimage and military vows. Thus began what we now refer to as the First Crusade. The official narrative, repeated by historians, theologians, and popularizers for 9 centuries, goes as follows. Western Christians, shocked by reports that Muslim conquerors, the Seljuks, were desecrating holy sites and oppressing pilgrims, rose up for a sacred war to liberate the Holy Sepulchre. It was a movement of faith, selfless, sacrificial, driven by sincere religious enthusiasm. This is partially true, and that is precisely why it is so challenging to unravel. Let's begin with the events that led to the speech in Clermont. Just a few months prior, Urban II received a letter from the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Comnenus. The letter included a plea for military assistance against the Seljuks, who had reclaimed a significant portion of Asia Minor from Byzantium over the past few decades. This was not a religious call, it was a political request from an ally in a difficult situation. Urban II was an astute politician. He fully realized that he had the opportunity to address several pressing issues with one move. Firstly, the knighthood of Western Europe had long posed a serious threat to social order. Landless younger sons from noble families, lacking peaceful occupations, resorted to pillaging, banditry, and endless private wars, which caused suffering to the peaceful populace and the church itself. Directing their aggression outward, toward war against the infidels, would be a brilliant solution to this problem. Secondly, the crusade offered a chance to significantly enhance the authority of the papacy, which at that time was in sharp conflict with the German emperors. Those who lead the war of all Christendom automatically elevate themselves above any secular ruler. Now, let's discuss the so-called persecution of Christians in Jerusalem. The Seljuks conquered the city in the year 1071, 24 years before Clermont. During those 24 years, pilgrimages to Jerusalem did not cease. Christian pilgrims continued to visit the holy city, paying tolls and praying at the tomb of the Lord. There was no systematic persecution of Christians there. This is supported by sources, including the Crusaders themselves, who upon their arrival in Jerusalem found thriving Christian communities. Urban's speech in Clermont exists in several versions, all of which were written after the campaign had been successfully concluded. Chroniclers describing it attributed words to the Pope that were already aware of the victory. We do not know with certainty what he said in November of the year 1095. The composition of the participants in the crusade is also worth noting. Alongside genuinely devout knights who vowed to live in poverty for the duration of the campaign were individuals with very specific earthly interests. The Norman adventurers from southern Italy, Bohemond of Taranto and his nephew Tancred, saw the crusade as an opportunity to establish their own states in the east. This is exactly what happened. Bohemond became the Prince of Antioch, not returning it to Alexius, to whom it rightfully belonged. Raymond of Toulouse aspired to become the King of Jerusalem. Godfrey of Bouillon, prior to setting off for the campaign, sold or mortgaged almost all of his holdings, which speaks not of selflessness, but of a man betting on future conquests. And finally, regarding what transpired during the capture of Jerusalem in the year 1099, chronicles, including those penned by the Crusaders, recount the large-scale slaughter of the city's inhabitants, regardless of their faith. Not only Muslims were killed, but also Jews, who were herded into synagogues and set ablaze, and Eastern Christians, whom the participants of the campaign could not distinguish from the enemies. These same chronicles describe how the warriors stood in blood up to their ankles, praising the Lord. They were individuals deeply convinced of the righteousness of their actions, and it is precisely this conviction that makes their deeds particularly shocking. The First Crusade was simultaneously a religious movement, a political initiative, and an imperial adventure. To explain it solely through one of these dimensions would be a falsehood. The truth is that people rarely act for a single reason, and history that simplifies the complex generally conceals something significant. From holy wars to a cup of tea. The next myth also concerns origins, but it is far more peaceful and much more elegantly crafted. Myth number 5. A random drink of the gods, or how the story of discovery is created. 3,000 years before our era, the wise Chinese emperor Shen Nong sits in his garden under a tree as a servant boils water for him, for even back then it was known in China that raw water is dangerous. A gentle breeze sweeps through the garden, dislodging a few leaves from the nearest branch and dropping them right into the boiling vessel. The water changes color, becoming a delicate amber. The court scholar, a naturally curious individual by virtue of his position, takes a sip. Aroma, flavor, vitality, clarity of thought. Thus, according to one of the most widely circulated versions, tea was discovered. This story is delightful. It features happenstance, a wise observer, and a majestic backdrop. It perfectly fits the genre of a discovery myth, the same genre as Archimedes in the bath and Newton with the apple. Chance plus an attentive mind, and something emerges that changes the world. The historical value of this tale is virtually non-existent. To start with, Shen Nong is a mythical figure. He is not a historical personage backed by documentary evidence. He is the legendary divine farmer, to whom Chinese tradition attributes the discovery of agriculture, medicine, various plants, and, yes, tea. He functions similarly to Prometheus or Romulus, a cultural hero to whom society ascribes what actually developed gradually, over millennia, through the efforts of millions of nameless individuals. The legend of Shen Nong and tea first appears in written records not in antiquity, but relatively late, in literature from the Tang dynasty, around the 8th century CE. This is roughly when tea began its transformation from a medicinal remedy and regional beverage into a national cultural phenomenon. In other words, the story of its discovery was crafted at a time when there was already a desire for a beautiful narrative about the origins of a beloved drink. What does real history tell us? It is much less romantic, yet far more intriguing. Tea as a plant, Camellia sinensis, originates from mountainous areas at the intersection of present-day Yunnan province in China, Myanmar, and India. This is a region where the plant has grown wild for thousands of years. The local peoples, primarily the ethnic groups of Yunnan, consumed the leaves of the tea bush long before it became a Chinese tradition. They chewed them, brewed them into broth with salt and fat, and used them as medicine. The earliest more or less reliable historical mentions of tea date back to the 3rd to 4th centuries of our era. This is not 3,000 years BC. It is 5,000 years later than the legend. Early documents primarily describe tea as a remedy. It was consumed for headaches, fatigue, and to aid digestion. It only became a drink for enjoyment much later. A significant cultural shift, the transformation of tea into a philosophical and aesthetic phenomenon, occurred during the Tang dynasty, 6th to 10th centuries AD. It was during this time that the canonical treatise by Lu Yu, the classic of tea, emerged, the first specialized work on tea in the world, outlining its preparation methods, types, and the aesthetics of tea drinking. This transformation of tea into an art form necessitated a fitting myth of origin, one that was venerable and linked to a legendary sage. Alongside the Chinese narrative, there existed an Indian version of the tea's origin, associated with the Buddhist monk Bodhidharma, who, according to legend, cut off his eyelids during meditation to avoid falling asleep, and from the fallen eyelids, tea bushes grew. This story is even more evidently mythological, but it highlights an essential connection. Tea and Buddhist meditation were intertwined, and it was through Buddhist monasteries that the beverage spread to Japan and Korea. The history of tea is the tale of how a practice, which emerged at the crossroads of several cultures, gradually evolved over the centuries into something so significant that it required a heroic myth of its birth. This narrative is more honest and engaging than the leaves in the emperor's bath. Yet, the leaves in the bath sell better. The subsequent myth also pertains to origin, and also about how precedence doesn't always belong to the first arrivals. Myth number 6. The city that became a capital later, or the forgotten early cities of America. New York. The very name resonates as a synonym for America. 5 boroughs, 8.5 million residents, Wall Street, Broadway, the Statue of Liberty in the harbor, skyscrapers piercing the mist. A global financial center, a cultural capital, a symbol of the American dream. Could it have been any other way? Wasn't New York the main city of the country from the very beginning? No, it was not. When the 13 British colonies declared independence in 1776, New York was under British occupation. It was occupied by the forces of General Howe and remained in British hands until November 1783, until the very end of the war. While the Continental Congress was convening in Philadelphia and the Declaration of Independence was being signed, New York was a city of loyalists and British garrisons. Philadelphia was designated as the first capital of the United States according to the Constitution, in a de facto sense, as the Congress met there during the Confederation period. However, the official first capital as per the Constitution became New York in the year 1789, a closer approximation of the truth, though it lasted less than a year and a half. It was here, in the Federal Hall building on Wall Street, that George Washington took the presidential oath. This was also where the first Congress of the nation convened. New York did serve as the first capital under the Constitution, but only for a brief moment. In the year 790, the capital moved to Philadelphia, where it remained for a decade while a new federal city was constructed. This was a compromise between the North and the South. Northerners favored Philadelphia, while Southerners preferred something closer to their own states. According to legend, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson reached a deal over dinner. The South would support Hamilton's financial plan, and the North would agree to place the capital on the banks of the Potomac. Thus, Washington, D.C. was born. Since the year 1800, it has been the official capital of the United States, a status it retains to this day. Meanwhile, in the early 19th century, New York surpassed Philadelphia in both population and trade volume, and it has remained the largest city in the country ever since. However, being the largest city and the capital are distinct concepts which, in the American context, have never coincided. The very notion of a specifically constructed capital was a deliberate political decision. The Founding Fathers did not wish for financial and political power to be concentrated in a single city. As a result, New York was allotted funding while Washington received authority. This division continues to operate today, fueling endless mutual irritation between the two cities. The narrative that New York has always been the main city is a projection of the present onto the past. It is psychologically understandable, but historically inaccurate. The next story is about a man who was also considered Maine, but for reasons far removed from what is typically believed. Myth number 7, Tyrant in a Toga, or Why Caesar Was Assassinated. "Run, Caesar, the Ides of March are dangerous," warns the soothsayer in Shakespeare's play. The 15th of March in the year 44 BC, the Curia of Pompeii, 23 dagger strikes, the most renowned political assassination in history, and the most well-known motive that circulates from textbook to textbook. The conspirators killed Caesar because he aimed to become king. He intended to abolish the Republic, crowning himself, establishing a monarchy, and the liberators, led by Brutus and Cassius, took his life in the name of republican ideals. This interpretation not only simplifies, it completely inverts the political reality of late Republican Rome. Let us begin with the very concept of king. In Rome, the term rex was not merely a political label, it was virtually a curse, a word steeped in the memory of the Tarquin tyrants who had been expelled 5 centuries earlier. The very foundation of the Republic was built upon the rejection of kingship. Rex embodied everything that Rome stood against. Julius Caesar understood this better than anyone. This is why, according to Plutarch and other sources, he publicly and overtly rejected the royal diadem that Mark Antony offered him during the Lupercalia celebrations in February of that very year. Once, twice, 3 times. Eventually, the crowd applauded his refusal. This was a meticulously orchestrated political performance, a demonstration that Caesar had no desire for regal authority. So what did he want? He already possessed it. By the time of his assassination, Caesar was a dictator for life, a position he held legally, thanks to a Senate decree. The dictator wielded more actual power than any king: total command of the army, the right to enact laws, and the authority to appoint magistrates. In reality, Caesar was already a monarch, just without that loathed title. So why assassinate him now, just days before his departure for a military campaign against Parthia? This is where the real story begins. The conspirators, about 60 individuals from the Senate class, were not targeting an abstract concept of monarchy. They were killing a specific individual who had altered the political landscape of Rome in such a way that their own power and privileges were in jeopardy. Caesar systematically dismantled the system that granted the senatorial aristocracy its power. He distributed Roman citizenship to provincial inhabitants. Thus, the Senate lost its monopoly on representation. He appointed his allies to key positions without adhering to the traditional cursus honorum, meaning that noble birth ceased to be the primary criterion for career advancement. He introduced Gauls and Spaniards into the Senate, thereby threatening the exclusive Roman nature of the senatorial class. Among the conspirators were many individuals whom Caesar had personally aided, pardoned after the Civil War, appointed to high offices, showered with riches. This was also part of his policy, and it was precisely this that irritated them the most. They were dependent on his favor. Thus, they were not free citizens of the Republic, but clients of a monarch, even if he did not claim that title. Marcus Junius Brutus, the most idealized of the conspirators, the very noble Brutus from Shakespeare, was a principled man, yet his principles were rather specific. He believed in republican institutions, but by republic, he meant a system where power belonged to the old aristocracy. Caesar's reforms threatened not the freedom of the people, but the privileges of the elite. The result of the assassination was not the restoration of the Republic, but its ultimate demise. 13 years of civil war, millions dead, and ultimately, Octavian Augustus, the first true monarch of Rome, who skillfully concealed his power behind republican terminology. The conspirators achieved exactly the opposite of what they desired. History is a cruel director. She enjoys such conclusions. However, the next tale is about a different traveler, a different era, and an entirely different type of adventure. Myth number 8, the first European in China, or what Marco Polo omitted. His book was dubbed The Million Lies. The Venetian merchant who spent 17 years at the court of Kublai Khan depicted China in such detail that his contemporaries disbelieved every single word. Porcelain? Paper money? Coal that burns underground? Cities with millions of inhabitants? It all sounded like fairy tales, or pure falsehoods. Marco Polo returned to Venice in the year 1295, imprisoned in Genoa, and there, according to legend, dictated his book to his cellmate, the novelist Rustichello. The description of the world, or the Book of Marco Polo, became one of the most widely read works in medieval Europe. For centuries, it reinforced the notion that the first European to reach China was the Venetian trader. This is false in at least two different respects. Firstly, Marco Polo was not the first. His father Niccolo and uncle Maffeo Polo had already been to China. It was they who brought the young Marco along on their second journey. But even they were not the first Europeans at the Mongolian court. As early as the year 1245, the Franciscan monk John of Plano Carpini was sent to the Mongols on a mission from Pope Innocent IV, who sought to understand the nature of the fearsome conqueror. He reached Mongolia, attended the Kurultai, witnessed the election of the new Great Khan, and wrote a detailed report. In the year 1253, another Franciscan, William of Rubruck, undertook a similar journey and left an even more detailed account. Giovanni da Montecorvino, in the year 1291, even before Marco Polo's return, journeyed to China as a Catholic missionary and spent the rest of his life there, establishing the first Catholic diocese in Beijing. He baptized several thousand Chinese individuals and corresponded with the Pope. Thus, by the time Marco Polo returned to Europe, there was already a documented tradition of European contacts with the Mongolian Empire, including China. Polo was not the first. He was the most eloquent. However, there is a second, far more provocative question. Did he even go there at all? This debate was revived in modern form in 1995 by British historian Frances Wood in her book, Did Marco Polo Go to China? Her arguments are as follows. In the description of the world, there is a complete absence of references to certain things that one cannot overlook in China. The Great Wall, tea, the ideographic writing system, printing, and the Chinese practice of foot binding for women. For a person who spent 17 years in the country, this silence is indeed peculiar. In Chinese sources from the time of the Mongolian Khans, Marco Polo's name is never mentioned, even though foreigners at the court of the Khan were recorded and described. His purported position as governor of the province of Yangzhou is not documented in any Chinese records. Supporters of Polo argue that the wall was in ruins during his time and was not regarded as a significant structure. He might have known tea by another name, and Chinese sources do not always document foreign officials. The debate remains unresolved. However, the very framing of the question sheds light on the nature of historical memory. Description of the world is a literary monument. Rustichello, the novelist who adapted Polo's tales, clearly infused them with artistic embellishments. Today, it is impossible to discern what is attributable to the merchant and what to his collaborator. Marco Polo endures as a grand symbol, even if his journey was not exactly as we conceive it to be. Symbols hold importance, yet the truth holds even greater significance. The next myth revolves around those who never traveled anywhere because they were annihilated. At least, that is the common belief. Myth number 9, the vanished empire, or what really happened to the Incas. The year is 1532. Francisco Pizarro, with a troop of 168 men, captures the Inca Emperor Atahualpa. He receives a ransom equivalent to a room filled with gold and silver. He then executes him. He takes Cuzco. The great empire of Tawantinsuyu, which stretched from present-day Ecuador to Chile, collapsed before a handful of conquistadors. This event stands out as one of the most astonishing military occurrences in human history, and has given rise to one of the most enduring myths. The Incas were destroyed. Their culture was obliterated, their people annihilated, their civilization erased from the earth by ruthless conquerors. The Incas are alive. There are millions of them. Peruvians, Bolivians, and Ecuadorians who speak Quechua are direct descendants of the Incas and the peoples incorporated into Tawantinsuyu. Estimates suggest that today, Quechua is spoken by between 8 and 10 million people. It is one of the few pre-Columbian languages in the Americas to hold official status. Quechua is a state language in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. The Spanish conquest did not eliminate the population, it transformed it. The demographic catastrophe of the 16th century was real and harrowing. Diseases, primarily smallpox, which arrived with Europeans, decimated between 50 and 90% of the population of the Americas in the first 100 years following contact. This is a genuine tragedy that cannot be overlooked. However, it is not the same as the destruction by the conquistadors. Viruses made no distinctions between Spaniards and Incas. Moreover, the conquest itself was far more complex than a battle of a handful of heroes against a helpless multitude. Pizarro entered the empire amidst a civil war between Atahualpa and his brother Huáscar. Many peoples, subjugated by the Incas in previous decades, viewed the Spaniards not as conquerors but as liberators and actively aided them. The Spanish allies among the indigenous populations numbered in the tens of thousands. 168 Spaniards alone could not have conquered anything. The Andean world after conquest did not become entirely European nor completely eradicated. It evolved into a mestizo and synthetic entity. Initially, the Incan aristocracy maintained its privileged status. Incan curacas collaborated with the Spanish administration, and the very Incan history and mythology became subjects of active documentation, primarily by Spanish chroniclers who recognized its significance. Cultural conquest was real and profound, instilling Christianity, abolishing the quipu, the knot-based writing system, and demolishing temples upon which churches were constructed. However, this cultural imposition did not equate to the annihilation of the people. Andean traditions, agriculture, culinary arts, weaving, and music continued to thrive, transforming and incorporating new elements along the way. Today, Peru boasts a vigorous movement for the rehabilitation of Incan heritage. The Inti Raymi festival, the Festival of the Sun, is celebrated annually by thousands. Politicians reference Incan identity. Quechua is taught in universities. This is not merely a remembrance of a destroyed people. It is a living culture, asserting its place in the contemporary world. The myth of the destruction of the Incas serves various interests. For the European colonial narrative, it renders the conquest complete and definitive. For the anti-colonial narrative, it bestows a martyr-like status on the victims. Both narratives overlook the descendants of the Incas, who have not disappeared and are very much alive and vocal about their existence. The truth is always more complex than convenient narratives. The following myth concerns another war and the belief that it was the last one. Myth number 10. A war to end wars, or how great hopes fade away. The war to end war. This phrase is attributed to H.G. Wells, who used it as the title of his 1914 book. Later, it transformed into an official rhetoric of the Allies, becoming a slogan that permeated culture. We fight for the last time, so that there will be no more war. This was the message politicians conveyed to their people. This belief was genuine, at least for a considerable number of those who held it, and this makes the story of its collapse even more tragic. The very notion that the First World War was the last war did not collapse in September 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland. It began to unravel immediately, in Versailles in 1919, when the victors constructed a peace that, ironically, perfectly nurtured the seeds of the next conflict. The Treaty of Versailles was not a peace settlement, but a punishment. Germany lost territories, paid unimaginable reparations, disbanded its army, and signed an article declaring war guilt, a provision that Germans perceived as an affront and lacked unequivocal historical justification. Wilson's 14 points, the plan for a just peace that Germany, among others, referenced while agreeing to the armistice, were essentially discarded by the European allies, who sought not justice but reparation. Foch, the supreme commander of the Allied forces, upon reviewing the treaty, uttered a prophetic statement. This is not peace. This is an armistice for 20 years. He was off by just a few months. The Second World War began exactly 20 years and 10 months after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. However, the war to end all wars did not turn out to be a conflict that established lasting peace anywhere else. While diplomats convened in Versailles, numerous armed conflicts raged across the globe. The Russian Civil War, the Greco-Turkish War, the Polish-Soviet War, and the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict were just a few examples. Wars in Ireland, Finland, and Hungary added to the chaos. The promised end of wars morphed into a kaleidoscope of conflicts, many of which were direct consequences of reshaping the world at Versailles. The phrase itself carried a psychological trap. To label any war as the last allows its participants a license for brutality. If it is the final time, then anything is acceptable, everything is justified. This reasoning enabled governments to demand sacrifices from soldiers and civilian populations that would never have been tolerable had people known that this was not the last war, but simply another in a series. The great hopes of 1918, the League of Nations, the self-determination of peoples, the conclusion of secret diplomacy, collided with the reality of human nature, national interests, and economic contradictions. The League of Nations existed without the United States, which had proposed it. The Senate refused to ratify it. Self-determination was applied selectively, wherever it was advantageous to the victors. Secret diplomacy did not vanish, it merely relocated from Berlin to Paris and London. The next myth also concerns what the organization was truly engaged in, as its reputation transformed into something entirely disconnected from real history. Myth number 11. The Inquisition bonfires, or what was really burned in the Middle Ages. Inquisition. The very word conjures images of dungeons, torture instruments, bonfires in public squares, and fanatical monks hunting down the slightest deviation from orthodoxy. In the collective consciousness, it is synonymous with terror, directed against everything unusual, new, or different, against scholars, philosophers, witches, Jews, and heretics of all kinds. The actual Inquisition was a fundamentally different institution, not benevolent, but inherently distinct. Firstly, the term Inquisition does not refer to a single organization, but rather a generic title for several different institutions that spanned centuries and operated under varying principles. The medieval papal Inquisition of the 13th century, the Spanish Inquisition of the 15th to 16th centuries, and the Portuguese and Roman Inquisitions were all distinct entities with diverse objectives and methods. The first and fundamental error. The medieval Inquisition was not established for the persecution of witches. Witchcraft in the 13th and 14th centuries was officially regarded as superstition, a delusion of the common people. Pope Alexander IV explicitly prohibited inquisitors from investigating witchcraft cases in 1258, unless such matters were clearly related to heresy. The Great Witch Hunts are not a phenomenon of the Middle Ages, but rather of the late modern period, spanning from the end of the 15th century to the beginning of the 18th century. Their peak coincided with the Reformation and religious wars, with the most extensive executions occurring in Protestant states rather than in Catholic ones. Secondly, the Inquisition was not established to fight against heretics. Its jurisdiction was limited exclusively to baptized Christians. Jews, being unbaptized, were formally outside its authority. The Spanish Inquisition targeted conversos, Jews and Moors who had accepted baptism, but were suspected of secretly continuing their former practices. This was a unique situation related to the Iberian Peninsula and the Reconquista. Thirdly, and this might come as a surprise, the Inquisition, by its standards of evidence, was, in certain respects, more just than the secular courts of the same era. This may sound provocative, but is supported by documentation. Inquisitorial procedures required 2 witnesses or a confession. Any confession obtained under torture had to be verified without torture. The accused had the right to know the charges against them, and appeals were permitted. By the standards of medieval secular court proceedings, these were quite high requirements. Torture was indeed used, this cannot be denied. However, it was strictly regulated. Blood could not be shed, bodily harm was prohibited, and the duration was limited. Compared to what occurred in secular prisons of the same time, this represented a mitigation rather than a harshening of practices. As for the thousands burnt at the stake, the actual figures starkly contrast with the legend. The Spanish Inquisition, throughout its 3.5 centuries of existence, condemned roughly 3,000 to 5,000 individuals to death, according to modern researchers who have gained access to Vatican archives. In reality, significantly fewer were executed, with many sentences being symbolically carried out, often by burning an image of the condemned. This does not, however, render the Inquisition an innocent institution, but it certainly does not equate to hundreds of thousands. Where did this reputation originate? From Protestant and Enlightenment propaganda. The black legend of the Spanish Inquisition was actively constructed by Dutch and English authors, political opponents of Spain, who found it advantageous to present it as an empire of religious terror. This legend dovetailed perfectly with the anti-Catholic sentiments of the era and was circulated so widely that it became a known fact. The next myth pertains to another institution, which also hides a far more intricate history of origin. Myth number 12, the Eternal State, or how the Vatican became independent. The Vatican, a minuscule state located at the heart of Rome, governed by the Pope, appears as ancient as the Catholic Church itself. Haven't the popes always ruled over these hills? Wasn't St. Peter, the first pope, crucified here? Haven't the bones of saints rested beneath these marble floors since time immemorial? The Vatican State has existed as an independent sovereign entity since 1929. That's just under a century. To fully appreciate how unexpected this is, a brief journey through the history of papal authority is necessary. For a significant portion of the Middle Ages and the early modern period, popes governed a considerable part of central Italy, known as the Papal States, which included Rome, Umbria, Marche, and parts of Emilia-Romagna. This was a genuine secular state complete with an army, taxes, and a bureaucracy. The Pope held the dual role of spiritual leader and secular monarch. In 1870, the Italian army led by General Cadorna entered Rome through Porta Pia and dismantled the Papal States. Rome subsequently became the capital of unified Italy. Pope Pius IX proclaimed himself a prisoner of the Vatican. He dramatically refused to acknowledge the Italian state and locked himself within the Vatican's walls. Successors to his papacy adhered to this principle for almost 60 years. The resolution of this conflict came about in February 1929, when Cardinal Pietro Gasparri and Benito Mussolini signed the Lateran Agreements. Mussolini sought the Church's support to legitimize his fascist regime. In return, the Vatican gained sovereignty over 44 hectares of territory, financial compensation for lost lands amounting to 750 million lira, and the recognition of Catholicism as the state religion of Italy. In exchange, Pope Pius XI recognized the Italian state and indirectly endorsed Mussolini's regime. This was a pragmatic deal, beneficial to both sides. The Vatican state was not born out of ancient tradition, but rather from the political calculations of 1929. It is symbolic that the smallest sovereign entity in the world, a state covering just a few city blocks, not only exists, but wields a disproportionately large influence on global politics. This, in itself, is quite remarkable. Why add a myth of ancient continuity to this history? The next myth concerns a masterpiece that we encounter daily in reproductions, yet know far less about than we might assume. Myth number 13, The Last Supper on Plaster, or why Leonardo broke all the rules. The year is 1495. Leonardo da Vinci undertakes a commission to beautify the refectory of the Santa Maria delle Grazie monastery in Milan. He will create the Last Supper, one of humanity's most renowned images, believed by millions to encode secret meanings, hidden codes, and messages for future generations. Most individuals, upon viewing the Last Supper, refer to it as a fresco. Leonardo painted it on canvas. That is one version. Or perhaps on wood. Or, of course, it could be a fresco. However, it is neither of those things. A fresco is a technique of wall painting where pigments are applied to wet plaster. The chemical reaction between lime and pigments creates an exceptionally durable bond. The paint literally becomes part of the wall. This is why Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel have survived 5 centuries in nearly pristine condition. Leonardo did not employ the fresco technique. He applied a layer of resin over dry plaster, then lead white, and on top of that, tempera and oil. Why? Because fresco painting requires quick execution while the plaster is wet and does not allow for alterations. Leonardo, however, was an experimental artist who could spend weeks contemplating a canvas without touching it, only to make a few strokes and retreat again. He desired the control that frescoes did not provide. The cost of this choice was borne by the artwork itself. During Leonardo's lifetime, the Last Supper began to deteriorate. The oil and tempera did not adhere to the dry plaster as they would have on a fresque. A few decades after its completion, the Duke of Milan's ambassador lamented that the painting was in terrible condition. By the 17th century, it had fallen into such disrepair that monks, unaware of how to preserve it, cut a door through the lower part of the wall, destroying the feet of Christ and several apostles. Napoleonic soldiers, who used the refectory as a stable, hurled clumps of dirt at the painting. Throughout the 19th century, it underwent several restorations, each time layering new materials over the original. During World War II, the refectory was bombed, but the painting survived beneath sandbags. By the 20th century, only fragments of Leonardo's original work remained. The restoration from 1978 to 1999, led by Pinin Brambilla Barcelon, was a monumental endeavor. 21 years of meticulous research, removal of later editions, and conservation of the original. Restorers worked under microscopes, peeling away layer by layer until they reached the little that Leonardo had left behind. What was revealed beneath centuries of overpainting? The faces of the apostles emerged, looking entirely different from the familiar reproductions. The color palette was far more delicate and cooler than the dark tones that had become ingrained in the perception of multiple generations of viewers. The space of the refectory, illusionistically continuing the real space of the monastery's dining hall, a depth that was visible only in the original. Leonardo's The Last Supper is simultaneously one of the greatest works of art and one of the most damaged by time. Its mystery lies not in encoded messages, but in the fact that the original has almost vanished, and we truly do not know how it looked. The following story is about a character whose existence is highly questionable, but whose legend lives more robustly than any fresco. Myth number 14. The noble robber, or who hides behind the name of Robin Hood. Sherwood Forest, green attire, a bow, an arrow, flying into the heart of an apple on the head of the innocent, taking from the rich and giving to the poor. A nobleman from an esteemed lineage turned into an outcast due to the injustices of Sheriff Nottingham. Robin of Locksley, Earl of Huntingdon, ally of Richard the Lionheart. Such a vivid and specific figure that it seems implausible that he never existed. He did not exist. More accurately, we lack proof of his existence. No medieval document verifies the actual Robin Hood. Not a single chronicle, court record, or tax report, and medieval bureaucrats kept these with remarkable diligence, mentions a bandit by that name operating in Sherwood Forest during the period typically indicated in legends, the late 12th to early 13th century. The name Robin Hood in medieval England served as a synonym for vagabonds and petty criminals, much like John Doe does today in American law. Court records include references to Robert Hood or Robin Hood as nicknames for individuals declared outlaws, but these are different people in various locations and times, with no apparent connection between them. The earliest literary references to Robin Hood are ballads, dated approximately from the year 1370 to 1450. In the earliest versions, he is not an earl, nor an ally of the king, nor a champion of justice in the contemporary sense. He is a commoner, perhaps a yeoman, a prosperous farmer, living in the woods. His enemies are not an abstract injustice, but very specific, abbots charging exorbitant interest and sheriffs collecting tolls. The class conflict is present, yet it is far more grounded than the romanticized versions of later eras. The image of the noble outlaw, who takes from the wealthy and gives to the needy, is a relatively recent development. In earlier ballads, Robin Hood is generous to his companions and guests, but he is not a systematic redistributor of wealth. He hides in the forest, ambushing merchants and monks, triumphing in archery contests. This is literature of dreams, dreams of a life outside the law, freedom from feudal obligations, and a just force standing against an unjust authority. The association with specific historical figures, such as Richard I, Prince John, particular dates and locations, occurred later, when the authors of ballads and novels sought to lend historical credibility to the legend. This is the same process that created Shen Nong as the discoverer of tea, or assigned Archimedes to a specific bathtub. The human desire for precise coordinates in mythology. The lack of a historical prototype does not diminish the significance of Robin Hood. Conversely, it liberates him. He exists not as a biographical fact, but as a cultural form into which each era pours its own meaning. In the 20th century, he becomes a socialist. In Hollywood versions, a superhero. In modern interpretations, a feminist or a corporate fighter. Mythological characters tend to outlast their historical counterparts. The next story will focus on a phenomenon commonly regarded as a genuine historical fact, but which may also be a myth, merely a myth concocted not by romantics, but by state propaganda. Myth number 15. The Villages for the Empress, or the Secret of the Potemkin Myth. The year is 1787. Catherine the Great journeys through the recently conquered Crimea, a territory whose annexation marked a triumph of her policies. Prosperous villages flash by along the road, well-kept cottages, content peasants, livestock grazing in pastures. The Empress is pleased. New Russia is thriving. But at night, according to legend, something strange occurs. The villages are dismantled, loaded onto carts and boats, and hurriedly transported ahead, so that the next day they reappear on the shore, already as new settlements. Facades without rear walls, painted windows, staged peasants being shuffled from one place to another. This was all orchestrated by Prince Potemkin, Catherine's favorite and de facto co-ruler, to hide the desolation of the conquered lands and impress the Austrian Emperor Joseph II, who was also part of the journey. Potemkin villages is such a resilient expression that it has become generic in many languages around the world. Facade displays that conceal genuine poverty, a facade, deception by the authorities. The issue is, this never actually happened. The journey itself is real, the route, real. Potemkin was indeed responsible for organizing the presentation of the conquered territories. However, the version of moving villages is propaganda created in real time by diplomatic adversaries of Potemkin and Russia. The primary source of the legend consists of diaries and letters from the Saxon diplomat Gelbke and the Austrian Prince Deline, who traveled in the entourage. Deline and other foreign observers in their private correspondences described what they perceived as artificial and ostentatious. However, their accounts were based not on their own observations but on rumors. None of them witnessed the dismantling and transporting of villages. Regarding the actual state of affairs, historians who have studied documents from that era, Potemkin's correspondence, economic reports, and testimonies from local officials, have found that New Russia was indeed experiencing active development. From 774 to 787, over 100 new settlements were established, cities were built, roads were constructed, and settlers were attracted. This is a documented, verifiable advancement. Potemkin did create decorative effects along the route: flags, triumphal arches, illuminations. This was normal courtly splendor for a ceremonial visit. However, this is fundamentally different from facade villages without rear walls. Where did the legend originate? From political rivalry. Potemkin's adversaries at court, envious of his position and influence, had a vested interest in discrediting him. Foreign courts, alarmed by Russia's strengthening in the south, were eager to portray Russian success in Crimea as illusory. The legend addressed both needs. The irony lies in the fact that the name of the most capable statesman of the Catherine era has become synonymous with deception, while his true legacy, Novorossiya, Odessa, Kherson, Mykolaiv, Sevastopol, endures to this day. The next story is about another capital that also was not always so. Myth number 16. Columbus of Capitals, or The Wanderings of American Power. Washington, District of Columbia, the White House, the Capitol, the Lincoln Memorial. It is hard to envision American authority anywhere else. Certainly, Washington has always been the capital. Could it have been otherwise? The answer to this question was already provided in the chapter on New York. However, the history of American capitals is richer and more intricate than simply first New York, then Washington. During the years of the War for Independence, the Continental Congress was nomadic. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Lancaster, for one day, the shortest-lived capital in history, York, Princeton, Annapolis, Trenton, New York. The Congress relocated for a variety of reasons: threats from British troops, dissatisfaction among local citizens, political strategies. The concept of capital during this period was quite fluid. Following the adoption of the Constitution in 1789, New York, from April to December 1789, then Philadelphia, from December 1790 to May 1800, and finally Washington, from June 1800. The construction of Washington proceeded slowly and painfully. When President Adams and Congress moved to the new capital in 1800, the city was essentially a construction zone in the middle of swamps. The White House was unfinished. Abigail Adams complained that there was no firewood, and she had to dry laundry in the staterooms. The streets were unpaved, and most of the intended buildings had yet to be erected. Officials resided in rented rooms with local farmers. Just 14 years later, the British burned Washington during the War of 1812. Congress fled, the White House was consumed by flames, and some congressmen proposed moving the capital back, either to Philadelphia or even to another site. This proposal narrowly failed, and Washington was restored. The history of American capitals is a tale of compromises, practical calculations, and political deals. There was nothing monumentally inevitable about the current location of the capital. It was a choice made under specific circumstances by particular people. The next myth is also about a choice, but this time regarding who was actually included in all. Myth number 17. Democracy for all, or who really voted in Athens? 5th century Athens, the cradle of democracy. This is known to every schoolchild. Citizens gather in the agora, Everyone can express their opinion. Each vote holds equal weight. For the first time in history, the populace governs itself, and this principle has laid the foundation for modern democracies for 25 centuries. This is true, and at the same time, it conceals something fundamental. The phrase every citizen in Athenian democracy referred to a very specific category. To be eligible to vote, one needed to be a male, born free, and the son of an Athenian citizen on both sides. These three strict criteria automatically excluded a vast portion of the population. Women, who represented about half of the free population, did not participate in political life at all. No exceptions, no qualifications. Slaves accounted for an estimated 20 to 35% of the population of Attica. According to some reports, during the peak of classical Athens, the number of slaves was approximately equal to that of free people. Slaves were not merely deprived of political rights, they were considered property. Metics, free individuals of non-Greek origin living in Athens, constituted a significant part of the urban population. They included traders, artisans, philosophers, even Aristotle was a metic, and artists. They paid taxes, served in the army, and contributed to the city's wealth. However, they had no political rights. Thus, from about 300,000 residents of Attica, the actual participants in the Athenian democracy numbered, by historians' estimates, between 30 to 40,000 individuals, meaning between 10 to 15% of the population. Does this diminish the significance of Athenian democracy? Not at all. The fundamental principle that not a single individual nor a narrow elite rules by birthright, but a collective of citizens making decisions through discussion and voting was revolutionary. And it indeed laid the groundwork for Western political tradition. But there's a problem. When we idealize Athenian democracy as the power of the people, we inadvertently accept its limitations. The notion that not everyone is worthy to participate in governance persisted in Western political thought for a long time and was rooted in the Athenian precedent. Those who opposed women's suffrage or the abolition of property qualifications in the 19th century often referenced classical examples. Athenian democracy was a great beginning, but it was not yet the establishment we consider it to be. The next story is about a grand project that collapsed, not quite for the reason you might think. Myth number 18, Yellow Fever at the Panama Isthmus, or the truth about the failure of the French. Panama. The late 19th century. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the triumphator of Suez, the great Frenchman, the man who cut a canal through Africa, embarked on a new grand project to connect two oceans across the Panama Isthmus. The idea was brilliant, the scale unprecedented, and the project failed. Almost 90,000 workers lost their lives. Shareholder funds disappeared. De Lesseps and his son were convicted of fraud. This became one of the largest financial scandals in the history of the Third French Republic. Why did the French fail? The official answer you will find in most textbooks: yellow fever and malaria. Tropical diseases killed workers faster than they could be recruited. Without the modern understanding of disease carriers, mosquitoes, it was impossible to combat epidemics. This was a medical failure. The reality is far more complex and significantly less flattering for the French leadership. Yes, the diseases were terrifying. Yes, the mortality rate on the construction site was horrific. However, the medical aspect was not the root cause of the failure, but rather a contributing factor. The underlying issues were engineering, financial, and managerial, discussions about which tend to be much less prevalent. De Lesseps insisted on constructing the canal at sea level, without locks like the Suez. This was an engineering blunder that had been pointed out to him from the very beginning. The terrain of Panama is incomparably more challenging than the Egyptian desert. The Continental Divide mountain range, unpredictable rivers, and an immense volume of rock to cut through. The Americans later built the canal, with locks, just as the French engineers had suggested to de Lesseps. To this day, the Panama Canal operates that way. The project's financial model was disastrous. De Lesseps deliberately underestimated public cost assessments to attract investors, Actual expenses exceeded projections several times over, and he was aware of this. When the initial stock issues did not generate sufficient funds, the company issued new shares, settling debts with new loans. This was a classic scheme that could only be sustained if the project was completed on time, and it was chronically delayed. Corruption was systemic. A significant portion of the funds went to bribing French parliamentarians and journalists, meant to protect the company's reputation and hinder investigations. When the scandal eventually erupted, it became one of the largest in French political history. Hundreds of officials, deputies, and senators were implicated in receiving payments from the Panama Company. Yellow fever was indeed a real catastrophe for those dying in tropical barracks. However, for the company's financial collapse, it served merely as a convenient explanation that helped to obscure the incompetence of leadership and the scale of corruption. The next myth is about a military victory, the explanation of which has also become legendary. Myth 19. The Archers of Agincourt, or Why the Victory Was Found Where It Was Not Sought. Henry V, by Shakespeare, a speech before battle. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Agincourt, the 25th of October, 1415. 6,000 weary, sick, rain-soaked English soldiers facing 25 to 30,000 of the French chivalry, and an astounding victory. How was this possible? The answer provided in textbooks, films, and popular literature is the English longbows. Welsh and English archers, capable of shooting 10 to 12 arrows per minute, literally rained down a hail of iron upon the French knights. The arrows pierced visors, exploited gaps in armor, and killed horses. The French were decimated even before they reached the English positions. This is true, at least in part. However, this partial truth conceals something significant. Longbows were indeed a formidable weapon, and English archers inflicted tremendous damage on the French cavalry. Yet the effectiveness of the bow can be attributed not solely to the skill of the archers. It is largely explained by the tactical situation at hand. The French knights launched their assault across a narrow field, flanked by forests on both sides. The heavy cavalry lost its maneuverability. The ground was damp and slippery after rains. Horses stumbled, and knights in heavy armor fell, unable to rise. The English archers stood behind rows of sharpened stakes driven into the ground, a simple but effective anti-cavalry barrier. However, the decisive factor in the victory at Agincourt is rarely addressed in popular narratives. Following the initial French charge, when significant losses had already occurred, Henry faced an unexpected dilemma. Thousands of prisoners taken during the fight. These captives were crowded, disoriented, but not disarmed. Suddenly, a squadron of French peasants appeared behind the English lines, attacking the supply wagons. Fearing that the prisoners might launch an assault on the guards at a moment when all forces were engaged in countering this new threat, Henry ordered the execution of most of the captives. This was a mass killing of individuals who had already laid down their arms, a gross violation of the chivalric codes of the time. Chroniclers describe this with horror. Shakespeare hints at it but carefully avoids condemning his protagonist. The victory at Agincourt was real and impressive, yet it was attained through a combination of strategic acumen, favorable terrain, weather conditions, and actions that contemporaries considered dishonorable. The myth of a pure triumph of heroic skill over numbers is a narrative shaped by later propaganda. The next myth transports us across the Atlantic, to the peoples whose dwellings became a symbol of an entire way of life. Myth number 20. All Indians in teepees, or how Hollywood invented America. A conical tent made of hides, adorned with geometric patterns, feathers in hair, a horse, a tomahawk. This image, the stereotype of the Indian, deeply rooted in popular consciousness, actually represents a very specific group of tribes, the peoples of the Great Plains, who emerged as a cultural phenomenon in the 18th and 19th centuries. Teepees are a remarkable structure, well suited for the nomadic life of bison hunters. They are quickly assembled and disassembled, retain heat during winter, and ventilate well in summer. They are stable against prairie winds. However, teepees were the dwellings of only some tribes of the Great Plains, the Lakota, Comanche, Cheyenne, and Blackfoot, and only those. Before European contact, the indigenous peoples of North America comprised several hundred distinct cultural groups, each with different languages, economic systems, and architectural traditions. The Iroquois built longhouses made of wood and bark, homes that housed multiple families simultaneously. The Navajo lived in hogans, round earthen dwellings. Peoples of the northwest coast constructed vast wooden houses adorned with intricately carved totem poles. The Pueblo built multi-story stone fortress-like homes that astonished Spanish conquistadors due to their similarities with the cities of Spain. The Seminoles of Florida resided in open platform houses tailored for the humid environment. The Inuit built igloos from snow and semi-subterranean homes. The term Indians itself is the result of a geographical blunder by Columbus, lumping together hundreds of nations that did not share more in common than Europeans do among themselves. It's akin to calling all inhabitants of Eurasia Eurasians and depicting them all in Russian Ushankas. How did the teepee become the universal Indian dwelling? Through the Hollywood Western. The tribes of the Great Plains, especially the Lakota, Sioux, became the main protagonists of the Indian Wars during the latter part of the 19th century. Their clashes with the U.S. Army occurred in front of numerous witnesses, were extensively covered by the press, and captured on cameras. The Wild West became the foremost American myth, and the peoples who inhabited it became the visual emblem of everything encompassed by the term Indian. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which toured the USA and Europe starting in 1883, showcased Lakota warriors and teepees as the main attraction. Millions of viewers around the globe have seen this particular image, and it became a standard. The rich diversity of real North America stands as one of the greatest sacrifices made at the altar of narrative. The next myth concerns a date that is widely regarded as completely accurate, yet it is not. Myth number 21. The 8th of May, or when the war actually ended. The 8th of May, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. VE Day. London, New York, Paris erupt in jubilation. The war in Europe has come to an end. This statement is accurate to about the same extent as saying, winter ended on the 1st of March. Germany's official surrender was signed twice. On the night of May 7th to 8th in Reims, this was a preliminary act signed with the Western Allies, and on the 9th of May in Berlin, a ceremonial event for the Soviet side, which insisted on a legally binding document in the presence of representatives from all Allied nations. This is why the USSR and many Eastern European countries celebrate Victory Day on the 9th of May, while Western nations observe it on the 8th. However, even this date did not mark the conclusion of hostilities. At the time of the surrender signing, German forces were still engaged in combat in several locations, not solely due to lack of information. Some German units surrendered to Western allies, refusing to capitulate to Soviet troops. On the island of Bornholm, the German garrison surrendered to Soviet forces on the 9th of May, but only after a Soviet bombardment. German troops on the Atlantic Wall, in isolated fortresses on the coast of France, surrendered over several days after the official capitulation. The Army Group Center, led by Field Marshal Schörner, continued fighting in Czechoslovakia for several days after the 8th of May. It was against this group that the last major offensive operation of Soviet forces in Europe was directed, the Prague Offensive, which concluded on the 11th of May. At sea, the situation was even more complicated. German submarines in the Atlantic received radio signals about the surrender, but the choice, either to surface and surrender or to dive to avoid capture, was made by each commander individually. Several submarines spent weeks after the 8th of May heading towards the shores of Argentina, where their commanders hoped to find refuge. A particularly extreme case involved Japanese forces on certain Pacific islands, which continued to fight for years, either due to lack of information about the surrender or disbelief in it. The last of such soldiers, Hiro Onoda in the Philippines, laid down his arms only in 1974, 29 years after the war had ended. War does not conclude the moment a piece of paper is signed. It is a gradual dying down that can take weeks, and sometimes even decades. The next myth concerns an event that is also commonly believed to be well documented, yet may have occurred quite differently. Myth number 22, the hammer of the reformer, or how Luther did not nail his theses. On the 31st of October, 1517, Martin Luther approaches the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, takes out a hammer, and ceremoniously nails a sheet with 95 theses against indulgences to the wood. The sound of the hammer resonates throughout Europe. The Reformation begins. This image has become an icon of Protestantism, a solitary monk challenging the entire might of the Roman Church with a symbolic act, the hammer and the nail as tools of revolution. Luther almost certainly did not nail the theses to the church door, at least not in the dramatic form that has become legend. The primary issue with this narrative is that it emerges in sources significantly after the event itself. The only source claiming that Luther nailed the theses is a biography written by his friend and associate Philip Melanchthon several years after Luther's death. Melanchthon was not in Wittenberg on the 31st of October 1517. Luther himself does not describe this event anywhere in his numerous letters and writings as a solemn public act. His own contemporary accounts of the situation are much more mundane. He sent the theses to several bishops and theologians, proposing an academic discussion. This was standard practice in universities, posting theses for debate. The door of the church at the university in Wittenberg was indeed used as a bulletin board. It is possible that some clerk or Luther himself did attach the theses to the door as an announcement for an upcoming discussion. However, the act of nailing them ceremoniously with a hammer is a reconstruction by later hagiographers. What happened next is far more intriguing than the hammer. Luther's theses were composed in Latin, targeting an academic audience. They were translated into German and, aided by Gutenberg's groundbreaking invention, the printing press, were disseminated across Germany in just a few weeks. This was the first instance of a viral publication in history, if we are to use contemporary terminology. The theses found their audience not because Luther ceremoniously nailed them with a hammer, but due to the sudden transformation in the technology of information distribution. The Reformation was made possible not because of the hammer, but because of the printing press. The next myth revolves around another organization, whose origins are often regarded as much older and nobler. Myth number 23, the Samurai Brotherhood, or what Yakuza really is. Yakuza, tattooed warriors of Japan's shadowy world, a code of honor, amputation of a finger as a sign of repentance, loyalty to the clan. In the collective consciousness, and to a significant extent in Japanese public discourse, the Yakuza is portrayed as a continuation of the samurai tradition, an organization with roots in feudal Japan, living by a code reminiscent of Bushido. The true origins of the Yakuza are far less romantic. The term Yakuza derives from a combination of cards in the Japanese game Oichokabu, 8, 9, 3. In Japanese, Ya stands for 8, Ku for 9, and Za for 3. This combination represents the worst possible hand in the game, equating to 0 points. Yakuza signified the loser, the worthless, a useless person. The organization self-identified as the outcasts of society, with bitter irony or as a provocative challenge. Historically, the roots of the Yakuza trace back to two groups from the Edo period, 17th to 19th centuries. Tekiya, itinerant traders who sold goods at fairs and markets, often engaging in deceit, and Bakuto, professional gamblers. Neither was related to the samurai class. These were individuals from the lowest echelons of the social hierarchy in Tokugawa Japan, classes not even included in the official four-tier system. The samurai aesthetic was consciously borrowed later as a means of self-legitimization. The principles of loyalty, hierarchy, and codes of conduct were all appropriated from samurai culture and imposed on criminal organizations seeking to portray themselves as more than simply a gang of racketeers. This was marketing, not history. Modern Yakuza, as an organized structure, largely emerged in the post-war period, particularly amidst the chaos of the black market and devastation following 1945. It thrived precisely when traditional state structures were weakened and the country's economy required informal mechanisms. There exists no continuous tradition from feudal times. Interestingly, Yakuza organizations actively cultivated and continue to nurture their samurai image. This benefits recruitment, maintains discipline, and facilitates negotiations with official authorities. Japanese society has long tolerated the existence of the Yakuza, largely because it embraced the narrative of organized crime as a guardian of traditional values. The next myth is about the speech that broke down the wall, both literally and metaphorically. Myth number 24, tear down this wall, or who really broke the USSR? On the 12th of June, 1987, President Reagan stood before the Brandenburg Gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, he declared. 2 years later, the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union disintegrated. The Cold War came to an end. In the American collective consciousness, and in a significant portion of American political rhetoric, this cause and effect relationship is often viewed as self-evident. Reagan defeated the USSR through the strength of his character, his speech, and his policies. However, the reality was considerably more complex and much less flattering to the notion that a single individual or a singular nation dismantled the Soviet system. Let us begin with the speech itself. It had no immediate impact. The Soviet press largely ignored it. No political changes followed right away. The West German media noted it briefly. The speech was recorded and forgotten, at least for that moment. The Berlin Wall did not fall because of Reagan's speech. It collapsed on the 9th of November, 1989, as a result of a series of absurd bureaucratic events. The new leader of East Germany called a press conference. He was asked about new regulations regarding travel abroad. He read a paper handed to him without fully grasping its meaning and announced that East German citizens could cross the border freely. When? Immediately, without delay. Crowds gathered at the border crossings. The border guards received no instructions. A senior officer made a unilateral decision to open it. That was it. The wall fell. This was not a planned operation. It was a mistake compounded by bureaucratic chaos. As for the dissolution of the USSR, it was a process rooted in the structural contradictions of the Soviet system that had been accumulating for decades. An economy unable to compete with the West in technological advancement, national movements in the Union republics, the Afghan War, which became for the USSR what Vietnam was for the USA. The oil shock of the 80s, which collapsed the primary source of Soviet revenue, increasing corruption and a loss of ideological legitimacy. Reagan's policies, arms racing, support for anti-Soviet movements, and the Strategic Defense Initiative did indeed create additional pressure. However, attributing the primary role to them means overlooking the deep-seated contradictions that Soviet citizens and their leaders experienced daily. Gorbachev, who chose not to use military force to suppress popular movements in Eastern Europe, did more for the peaceful conclusion of the Cold War than any American speech. This decision, to refrain from deploying troops in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, contradicted the entire logic of the Soviet system, and it cost him his power. History seldom unfolds due to a single speech. However, a well-timed speech can serve as a magnificent epilogue to a complex process. The next myth centers around a scientific discovery, which is often attributed to a single individual. Myth number 25, waves in space-time, or who really foresee gravitational waves? September 2015. The LIGO detectors capture the first credible signal of gravitational waves, ripples in the fabric of space-time caused by the merger of two black holes. This represents one of the greatest discoveries in the history of physics. Immediately, the remark follows, Einstein was right, because it was Einstein who predicted the existence of gravitational waves within his general theory of relativity in 1916. This is true, yet it is also an incomplete narrative. Firstly, Einstein himself doubted the reality of gravitational waves. In 1936, he co-authored a paper with Nathan Rosen asserting that gravitational waves do not exist, They are a mathematical artifact rather than a physical reality. The journal Physical Review rejected the paper with critical comments from reviewers. Einstein was indignant. The editorial board later published a corrected version with the opposite conclusion, after Einstein reviewed the reviewers' arguments. Thus, Einstein initially predicted gravitational waves, then retracted the prediction, and later revisited it. This is standard scientific practice, but it is not the linear narrative of "a genius predicted, we confirmed" that is typically conveyed. Secondly, a tremendous contribution to the actual existence of LIGO, the detector that identified gravitational waves, was made by individuals whose names are largely unknown to the general public. Rainer Weiss, Kip Thorne, and Barry Barish were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2017, rightly so. However, LIGO was built and launched through the collaborative efforts of thousands of scientists and engineers over 40 years. The very technology of laser interferometry, which enabled the detection of vibrations smaller than a proton, is the result of decades of engineering work unrelated to Einstein's name. Thirdly, Henri Poincaré utilized a concept very akin to gravitational waves as early as 1905, a year prior to Einstein's special theory of relativity and 11 years before the work on gravitational waves. The history of science is far more collective than the narrative of lone geniuses. The next story concerns a tragedy whose official recognition took a century. Myth number 26. Recognized genocide, or how the world looked away. The genocide of the Armenians has been recognized by the global community. This statement can be heard in various contexts, often taken for granted, as if international recognition took place a long time ago, unanimously, and has become a settled fact. In reality, this remains one of the most painful and unresolved issues in international historical policy. The Armenian genocide from 1915 to 1923 claimed, by various estimates, between 600,000 and 1,500,000 lives. This systematic extermination of the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire, including deportations to the Syrian desert, mass shootings, and forced death marches, is extensively documented through diplomatic reports, accounts from American and German, Turkey's allies, as well as neutral sources, photographs, and testimonies from survivors. Turkey officially denies the genocide, referring to the events of 1915 as tragic events or mutual losses during wartime. This is the state's official stance, which has remained unchanged since the founding of the Republic of Turkey. When did the major powers finally recognize the genocide? The United States formally acknowledged it only in April 2021 under President Biden. Prior to this, American presidents had steered clear of this term due to strategic partnerships with Turkey, a NATO member. Biden's predecessors from both parties, including those who promised recognition during their campaigns, consistently backed away from it after being elected. Germany recognized the genocide in 2016, 100 years after the events, in which its own diplomats and military were witnesses and at times participants. This was not a unanimous decision. The resolution sparked intense debate, and Turkey recalled its ambassador. To date, approximately 30 countries have recognized the genocide. This is a significant portion of the global community, but far from all. Neither the United Nations as a whole, nor most countries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East have granted official recognition. This remains a live, unresolved issue and is not a historically settled fact. Historians refer to this as the geopolitics of memory. The recognition or denial of historical atrocities is influenced not only by historical evidence, but also by current alliances, economic interests, and strategic calculations. The next myth pertains to another event of the 20th century, which is often portrayed differently from the reality. Myth number 27. Without warning, or what Japan knew before Hiroshima. August 6, 1945. Hiroshima. Enola Gay. The first combat atomic bomb in history. 140,000 people would die by the end of the year. This was a sudden strike, of which Japan had no prior warning. This is not entirely accurate. Several days before the bombing of Hiroshima, American airplanes dropped leaflets over Japanese cities, warning of impending destruction. The leaflets were vague, failing to mention the new weapon, and not naming specific cities. The exact targets were kept secret for military reasons, but they urged the Japanese to evacuate from munitions-related urban centers. Approximately 35 Japanese cities received warnings about aerial assaults several days prior to the attacks themselves. This was a standard practice of American strategic bombings. Specifically, before the strike on Hiroshima, on the 13th of July in 1945, President Truman was informed that the Trinity test had been successful. On the 26th of July, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, a demand for Japan's unconditional surrender under the threat of prompt and utter destruction. The declaration did not explicitly mention the atomic bomb, due to several reasons, including the fact that the United States was still uncertain about the operational capability of a combat version. The Japanese government rejected the ultimatum. This decision appears to have been made amidst sharp disagreements within the Japanese government and military. Some leaders recognized that the war was lost, while others believed it was possible to continue. Regarding the decision to drop the bombs, the debate over its moral justification continues to this day. Were all alternatives thoroughly explored? Was a demonstration over uninhabited territory feasible? Did the Soviet entry into the war against Japan expedite its surrender? These questions do not have definitive answers, but the fact remains: the bombing of Hiroshima was not without warning in the absolute sense that is often portrayed. It lacked specific warning about specific weaponry in a specific city. This represents a different level of consideration. The next story pertains to individuals who lived outside the law, yet created unexpectedly complex legal systems. Myth number 28. Democracy on a pirate ship, or the truth and romanticism of piracy. Pirates of the Caribbean. The Jolly Roger flying from the mast, Blackbeard, Calico Jack, Bartholomew Roberts. In popular culture, especially after historian Marcus Rediker described pirates as a kind of maritime anarchists in his book Villains of All Nations, the image of the pirate ship has emerged as a utopia of equality. Democratic elections for captain, fair distribution of loot, social insurance for the injured, and voting rights for everyone. This is not a myth, it's a half-truth with significant omissions. Pirate articles, codes of conduct aboard, indeed existed and were remarkably democratic by the standards of their time. Many of them have been preserved in the court records of those who were caught and tried. The captain was elected by the crew's vote and could be deposed by them as well. The share of the loot was divided according to pre-agreed rules. Compensation was provided for injuries, a form of insurance. These are real facts. However, there was another aspect that the romanticized version overlooks. The democracy on a pirate ship applied only to those who willingly joined the crew. A significant portion of the crews was captured from seized vessels and recruited under duress. Such individuals formally signed the articles, but their consent was coerced. Historians debate the actual proportion of volunteers and coerced individuals on various ships. Captured prisoners who refused to join were subjected to torture or even execution, systematically in fact. When it came to democracy on board, it was reserved for the few. For everyone else, there existed a reign of terror. Moreover, the very concept of democracy had strict limitations. The quartermaster, the second in command, held significant authority that restricted the captain's power. However, in combat, the captain wielded absolute authority. Articles detailed the discipline and punishments. There was no place for anarchy. The pirates of the Golden Age, around 1730, operated within a unique historical context. Many were former privateers or military sailors left unemployed after the wars for the Spanish succession. Their democratic practices were, in part, a reaction to the brutality of the official navy, where captains had total control, salaries were delayed, and punishments were harsh. The romanticization of piracy is quite understandable and, to some extent, justified. However, it should not obscure the fact that pirates were primarily criminals, engaging in murder and robbery. The next myth is about the man who discovered a new world, all while not realizing it. Myth number 29, the stubborn discoverer, or what Columbus really thought. The claim that Columbus remained convinced until his death that he had discovered India sounds like a condescending joke about one man's stubbornness, a great navigator unable to accept the obvious. An obstinate old man insisting on India while the entire world already knew the truth. The reality was far more complex. First, Columbus did insist until his death that he had reached Asia, but this was not mere mad stubbornness. It was a conscious stance rooted in his theoretical calculations and theological beliefs. He believed he had reached the eastern islands of Asia, the Spice Islands, part of the vast Asian archipelago. This interpretation explained much of what he observed. Secondly, the very notion of the New World did not emerge immediately. The first person to formally express the idea that the lands to the west were not Asia but a separate continent was Amerigo Vespucci in his writings from the early 16th century. His name ultimately gave the continent its title. However, this occurred only after several expeditions. Thirdly, and most importantly, Columbus was aware of the actual distances. He understood that Greek geographers had approximately calculated the Earth's circumference correctly. To align his calculations, he intentionally underestimated the distance to Asia, employing Arabic miles instead of Italian ones when it suited his purposes. He aimed to reach Asia within a reasonable distance. When his ships reached land precisely where he expected to encounter the Asian islands, it seemed to validate his calculations rather than refute them. The saddest part of this story is that Columbus, it appears, died disappointed and in disgrace, having not received the privileges owed to him per his agreement with the Spanish crown. His discovery was immediately reinterpreted by others, his routes improved, and his management of overseas territories deemed catastrophic, and rightly so. The man who changed the world was not recognized in his lifetime, even by those who benefited the most from his contributions. History serves as a brutal accountant. It records accomplishments on behalf of the victors, rather than the pioneers. The final myth concerns a disease often regarded as a thing of the past. Myth number 30, the end of the plague, or a disease that never left. The Black Death. From the years 1347 to 1353, 1/3 of Europe, corpses in the streets, gravediggers unable to keep up with the demand for graves, visions of hell invading the real world. And then, a gradual subsiding, with subsequent waves that were slightly less severe, even less so, and finally, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the complete disappearance of the disease from Europe. Did the plague vanish? The plague did not go anywhere. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague, exists within rodent populations around the globe, in the American plains, Central Asia, Africa, and China. It has not disappeared. It simply stopped killing people en masse, though historians and epidemiologists still do not fully understand why. The plague continued to claim lives even after the 14th century, just on a much smaller scale. Epidemics in London during the 17th century took thousands of lives. The Great Plague in Marseille from 1720 to 1722 resulted in the deaths of around 50,000 individuals, half the city's population. The third pandemic, of the plague, which began in China in 1855, spread worldwide and claimed more than 12 million lives, primarily in India. This is the 20th century. It is not the Middle Ages. According to the World Health Organization, between 1 and 2,000 cases of plague are reported globally each year. The most common hotspots include Madagascar, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Peru, and Bolivia. An outbreak in Madagascar in 2017 was declared an emergency by the WHO. Over 2,000 cases and more than 200 deaths. Cases of plague occur in the United States, averaging several cases each year, primarily in the southwestern region, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. The source involves squirrels, prairie dogs, and other wild rodents. The most recent fatality in the U.S. occurred relatively recently. Why did the plague cease to kill millions in Europe? There is no definitive answer. Theories suggest improvements in sanitation, changes in the ratios of black and brown rats, with brown rats less inclined to coexist with humans, and possibly the evolution of immunity in a portion of the population who survived multiple epidemics. Antibiotics developed in the 20th century allow for effective treatment of the plague if identified promptly. However, the bacterium itself has not vanished. The notion of the plague as a medieval disease is deeply ingrained and fundamentally misguided. It fosters a false sense of security. The history of diseases does not recognize final victors. It only acknowledges temporary truces. And now we have reached the last page of this archive. 30 myths. 30 times, history proved to be more complex, intriguing, and honest than we often assume. What unites all these narratives? Myths stem from needs: the need for a hero, for straightforward explanations, for compelling symbols, for convenient adversaries, and for legitimizing narratives. These needs are entirely human and comprehensible. The issue arises when we fail to distinguish myth from fact and begin making decisions based on appealing stories rather than actual events. History is not a repository of ready-made answers. It is a vibrant conversation that each generation must engage in anew. And this dialogue necessitates a willingness to confront discomfort, embrace complexity, and let go of what was commonly accepted. Archives continue to keep their secrets. Researchers persist in asking challenging questions, and myths endure because we continue to nourish them. The issue is not whether new myths will emerge. They certainly will. The question is how quickly we will learn to recognize them. Until the next discovery of an archive.